Formula 1 is unique among single-seat motorsports because unlike any other formula of open-wheel competition, Formula 1 teams design and build their own vehicles. And if they need to find pace, they start looking at other teams to see which parts of their car they can take and use it to improve theirs. Unless you're Racing Point or Tracing Point a few years ago, where they just copied the Mercedes and then had a half-decent season. But aside from that, the teams design and build their own cars. Unless you're Haas, in which case you outsource it to Dallara. But either way, if this thing works for one team, it must work for another, right? But the point remains, you'll see teams looking at what makes one car good, and then start working on how to make that work on their car to make their car better. And there has been several times over the years where the teams have had no choice but to copy what others were doing. The first instance of this was the wings that started appearing on Colin Chapman's Lotuses in the late 1960s. No, actually, before that, the rear engine revolution. Something that even Enzo Ferrari had to swallow his pride over and join in with, because rear engine cars were the future, with Jack Brabham taking the first rear engine championship in 1959. After that, everything was rear engine. Then it was the wings, even if Enzo was still engines better, aero for people that can't make engines, and so on. Then came ground effect, the turbos, carbon fibre, and the most recent innovations that everybody scrambled to copy were the double and blown diffusers and the F-duct that later became DRS. Other innovations were swiftly banned because the teams couldn't copy the system or were simply over-engineering them and it was just easier to get them banned. The second brake pedal that McLaren had in 1997 and the beginning of 1998 springs to mind, and the mentioning of the fiddle brake just allows me to post some MP413 shots, if anything else. But in between rear engine, turbos, ground effect, wings and so on, and the double and blown diffusers was the digital era, a very short era in the early 1990s that peaked in 1993 that was swiftly ended. Now, I've talked about the FW15C, the active suspension stuff, and the McLaren MP48 in their own dedicated videos at some point over the last 12 months or so. And the MP48, as it turns out, was as advanced, if not more advanced than the Williams by the end of the 1993 season, just with an underpowered engine. Give that McLaren horsepower on par with the Renault in the back of the Williams and Senna probably wins the title instead, because of how those cars had to be driven. It was a method of driving the cars that super smooth Prost and Hill just couldn't wrap their heads around. And those cars were just something else. They had active suspension, traction control, fully automated gearboxes, ride height that adjusted based on how far they were in between corners, anti-lock brakes, launch control. Basically, these things had everything that you're more likely to see on a modern road car than on a racing car today. The closest thing to adjustable ride height these days is probably Indy cars. They've got weight jackers, which are sort of ride height controls, but they're nothing like what they had on Formula 1 cars in the early 90s. It's weird to think that in terms of onboard driving aids, these cars were the most advanced Formula 1 cars ever created. Weight jacker on an Indy car is something that raises the right rear corner of the car, so that it effectively falls over more as you turn in. So the rule of thumb is the more you turn it up, the more turning you generate because the rear falls over and then the physics just loops the car around using force of some description. I think it's centrifugal force, but I'm not an physicist. And if you turn it down, you generate more understeer, and they can tune it dependent on dirty air, fuel, the weather conditions, and so on and so forth, as well as having adjustable anti-roll bars on the front and rear that they can use to fine-tune the effects of the weight jacker. I hope that covers it. But it's very well documented that Williams was far ahead of the game. By the time McLaren caught up, the 1993 season was over and the gadgets were going to be banned for 1994. But in the race, no pun intended, to get on Williams' level, all of the other teams on the 1993 grid were running at least something that Williams and McLaren had, with the amount of gadgetry and or the performance of said gadgets varying up and down the grid. So who had what? All of the teams had, at the very least, traction control. That was the one driver aid that didn't cost so much to develop. But a bulletin issued by the FIA in the run-up to the Canadian Grand Prix of 1993 said that 7 teams were alleged to be in violation of Article 3.7 of the technical regulations, which concerned the rules around parts influencing aero performance not remaining immobile in relation to the sprung part of the car, which usually translates to active suspension. Those teams were Williams, naturally, Tyrrell, Benetton, McLaren, Lotus, Minardi, and Ferrari. Some of the teams haven't been mentioned here, but the ones not mentioned, with the exception of Lola or Scuderia Italia, BMS Scuderia Italia, whatever you want to call them, were being collared for the use of traction control. And it's the Ferrari I want to look at today, because I've done the 1992 Ferrari before and talked about how it basically wrecked Ivan Capelli's career, because he drove it and then just lost the bug for racing in Formula 1, so he went and did some other bits and pieces after that. But in 1993, Ferrari tried to fix the car, and it ended up just turning into a transitional year. So, as a recap, the 1992 Ferrari was terrible. Prost had gone on his sabbatical year and rejoined in 1993 with Williams, so Ferrari had Alesi and Capelli in the car for the 1992 season. Capelli had run several mid to the back of the grid cars in his career, but he described the F92 as the worst Formula 1 car he'd ever driven, with the now defunct F1 Reject site doing an article on his 1992 season under the title of Ivan the Terrible. Ouch. But the car was just bad in virtually every way possible. Firstly, the engine suffered from blow-by, which reduced the V12's power output by around 50 horsepower, and that must have been torture because the double-decker floor, which was unique to that car, was producing a decent level of downforce. Because of Ferrari being Ferrari, where descent towards the engine was tightly controlled because won't somebody please think of the brand image, all the blame for the car being crap was put solely on the actual car, rather than the engine having up to 50 horsepower less than it should, considering that it was a hulking 12-cylinder 3.5 litre king of scream. 2 podiums from Alesi were the best it could muster. Capelli left the team with a couple of races left on the calendar, and he did score a small amount of points that year, but his confidence and enjoyment for racing had been utterly destroyed. He was replaced by Nicola Larini, who did the last couple of rounds of 1992 with a prototype active suspension system that cost him 30 kilos in weight versus Alesi, and he couldn't make the top 10 while Alesi was scoring points. So for 1993, Ferrari had to basically chuck most of the 1992 car in the bin and start again, but it wasn't as simple as I just made it sound. But on the horizon, help was on the way, and the 1993 season would kind of nudge things in a direction towards absolute dominance. The World Sports Car Championship and the Group C era of sports car racing had died with a whimper in 1992. Max Mosley, the president of FISA, not the FIA, yet, was planning on cancelling the 1992 season after his election in 1991 due to lack of interest. But Peugeot, who had chucked in a lot of money thanks to the rule changes that saw the Group C cars have what was essentially Formula 1 engines dropped in them, fought against Mosley, convincing him there would be enough interest after all. As it was, the season went ahead, with barely enough cars to make it worthwhile, and various concessions had to be made to fill the grid at Le Mans. Peugeot, with the 905, won the World Sports Car Championship and also the 24 Hours of Le Mans that year. So why am I mentioning Group C sports cars in a video about Ferrari? It's all because of the man who helped to convince Mosley to make it all go ahead in the first place. The husband of Captain Filippo Giorgio himself, Jean Todt. Todd had been introduced to the Agnelli family by Bernie, who then introduced him to Cesare Romiti, who was the managing director of Fiat. From there, it was an introduction to Luca de Montezemolo, who himself had just been appointed the president of Ferrari. In the August of 1992, Todd had been in secret meetings with Luca about potentially becoming the new boss of the Ferrari Formula 1 team. This was because Todd had form in motorsport. Starting out as a rally co-driver, he then got appointed the boss of Peugeot Sport in 1982, a time when Peugeot was struggling, and struggling big time. Todd was the boss when Peugeot developed the 205 T16, which helped to rescue the company's fortunes when the car started winning rallies. His success was a very quick turnaround, with Peugeot winning the WRC back-to-back in 1985 and 1986, and then won the Dakar in 87, 88 and 89. And then it was on to winning the World Sports Car Championship in 1992. And that's why he attracted the attention of Ferrari, because he got stuff done. Because Ferrari is Italian motor racing. The Italian press sharpens the knives and preps the horses' heads on a daily basis, and always needs a reason to slag off the team when it's not doing well. By this point, Ferrari had developed a string of bad Formula 1 cars, and Prost was sacked in 1991 for badmouthing said car. On top of this, by the time 1992 rolled around, Ferrari hadn't won a race since the 1990 Spanish Grand Prix, and hadn't won a constructors since 1983. They hadn't won a drivers since 1979. The Italian media and the Tifosi expected better. So while Luca and Todd were talking business, Ferrari set about fixing everything that was wrong with the F92. And, well, to be fair to them, they sort of did, but it didn't go anywhere near as well as they would have hoped. They made it more conventional compared to the previous year's car. That double-decker floor was gone and the car had been made a bit simpler to try and improve the airflow and reduce drag. At the same time, Ferrari's engine boffins were working out a way to reduce the blow-by on the engine and recoup some of the power that was lost. If they could work it all out, then maybe they could be a tad more competitive than they had been previously. But there was another problem. The F92 had been designed by Jean-Claude Migeot, and work on the 93 car had been well underway when he was sacked at the start of 1993. So the 1993 car still had some of the underlying issues aerodynamically that the F92 had, and the guy who designed it was now gone. So you have to do what you would normally do in this sort of a situation. Call the following year, where you know you're going to have a terrible car, a transition year. The plan was get through the season and then work on something brand new for 1994, because John Barnard, who had left for Benetton at the end of 1991, had come back, and the 1994 car was going to be his first clean sheet design. But the whole situation at Ferrari was grim. Alesi had been there for 5 years and had been through 4 team principals, and to make matters worse, nobody at Ferrari seemed to know who exactly was designing the car, and the guy who had designed the car had been fired with nobody there knowing exactly what he designed in the first place. Like I've said before, Schumacher and Lauda were the exceptions, not the rules. Not only that, when Alesi and new teammate Gerhard Berger got in the car to do their first runs at Fiorano, they began wondering what the hell they'd just been handed. But at least some of the engine issues had been sorted out. The blow-by was reduced a bit, allowing some more power to be produced, but the attention had now turned to the active suspension system that was now the big issue on the car. Ferrari just could not get it to work on the level that Williams had managed to in the 1992 season, and not only that, it was proving to be unreliable at the same time. Alesi wasn't exactly an advocate of the driver aids at the time to start with, but he hated the micromanagement of the system, saying, "At the beginning, everything was permitted. At this time, a clever engineer could reduce the system as much as possible and not try to use it everywhere. In our case, we were pulling up the nose on the straights to have less drag, having it go down in the corner and then up on the exit. It was too much operation during one lap. After the first laps we were doing with the engineer, we were deciding the ride height of the car metre by metre, and when we crossed the finish line, we had to reset it lap after lap." Finding exact information on it has been tricky. All the stuff for this time period concerns the 1992 car rather than the 1993 car. I think the Ferrari system was automated, but the drivers had to do some bits and pieces themselves. It was supposed to reset upon crossing the finish line, but the drivers might have had to do a manual reset themselves, just in case. Like I said, not sure, but either way, it was not a good system at all, and at some point the drivers had to do some of the stuff themselves. But scarily, this active suspension system seemed to have a mind of its own, which kind of ties into the reason why Mosley banned it in the first place back in the sort of summer of 1993, when he finally became the president of the FIA. When Alesi got in to do a test, the suspension bounced up and down like a space hopper when the engine was fired up, completely by its own volition. And looking at the stats for the season, 5 of the retirements from the 16 races were active suspension related. Both cars retired with issues at the European Grand Prix at Donington, and other retirements were engine, gearbox or electrical related, so standard Italian engineering. But it's at Estero where the fears from the FIA were kind of realised, and at least in their mind, the justification for banning the systems was realised. Berger left the pits, and as he did so, the front end of the car was up and the rear down, as it would have been on the start-finish straight. Because the system hadn't reset, the rear of the car grounded out on a bump and Berger spun across the track, almost wiping out Derek Warwick's footwork. But there had been some improvement to Ferrari in the second part of the season, despite Berger's massive crash. Todd had finally arrived, with his contract starting in the June of 1993. Basically, he won Le Mans on the Sunday and was at Maranello on the Monday, and started exerting his influence on the absolute shower of shite that had been brewing at the team. Harvey Postlethwaite had decided screw this and gone back to Tyrrell before Todd arrived, and Barnard's remit at the time was to continue working on the active suspension despite him needing to work on the 1994 car and the driver aids being banned for 1994. Barnard working out of an office in the UK didn't sit well with Alesi, because Alesi thought that Barnard should be in Italy working on the car, not in Guildford. There was also the feeling from Barnard that he was only working on this system because Ferrari had spent so much money developing it, having worked on a prototype as early as 1989, to can it now. What also happened during the season was improvements to the engine, which is probably the only thing that did get better over the season, because Ferrari had made the big brain move to hire a bunch of Honda engineers after Honda left Formula 1, because they'd built a constructors winning V12 in 1991. Asam Goto, who worked for Honda during the Senna years, was appointed head of engine research at Ferrari in 1993. The new valves and camshafts they used to improve the engine had got some Honda DNA in them, with Goto writing letters back home to his old mates in Japan saying, maybe I should put a little H on the engine block because it's kind of my bits on there. Ferrari had gone into 1993 expecting a car with driver aids to be way more competitive than it was. They had a good driver pairing as well that should have done the job, but instead of fighting with Williams, McLaren and now Benetton, with Benetton now starting to be a more consistent fixture on the podium and the top spot with Michael Schumacher, Ferrari was retiring from so many races and being so far off the pace generally that their battle in the Constructors' Championship was with Ligier, of all teams. And the season wasn't much better than it was in 1992. They scored 28 points versus the 21 they'd got the previous year, with Alesi using that improved V12 at Monza to take a very popular second place, albeit in a race that had a lot of attrition and still behind the V10 powered Williams of Damon Hill. So much attrition that Michael Andretti finished on the podium, and Alesi was the only other car on the same lap. In addition to Alesi's second place, Berger was able to get 2 third places on his return to the team, but both drivers would have been looking forward to the 1994 season and getting the 1993 car well out of the way. Fighting with Ligier for 4th in the Constructors probably wasn't their idea of fun and certainly not what they were expecting going into 1993, but in all, the 1993 season was a blessing in disguise for Ferrari. They now had a proper leader, and that leader became known as the Napoleon of the paddock. Todd was getting stuff done, and one of the early decisions he made was to hire an English mechanic by the name of Nigel Stepney to whip up the pit crew into a well-oiled machine with British Army levels of precision and professionalism, making them the equivalent to Red Bull under Jonathan Wheatley. Todd also started clearing out the dead weight, and according to Alesi, when Barnard left in 1996 to be replaced with Rory Byrne and also the appointment of Ross Brawn, things improved significantly, and all of this was impressing Montezemolo so much, he just let Todd get on with it. And because Ferrari had endured such a torrid time with the active cars, they came out the other side in 1994 with a car that was less of a pain in the back bottom than some of the other teams on the grid, particularly Williams and McLaren. With a conventional car that Alesi and Berger liked more than the previous one, they would be able to drive it properly. Alesi told Autosport that the active suspension took all the feeling out of the car, and he couldn't feel the weight transfer like he could in a regular car. At that same Portuguese Grand Prix that Berger had that massive crash, Alesi had taken 4th place without the active suspension on the car. But the lack of info available for this car shows that it's largely forgettable. Ferrari even went as far as to paint some white on it to hark back to the glory years of Niki Lauda, but that didn't seem to do much. If anything, the overall design of the car made it look like the Scuderia Italia cars that never made the end of the season, which is probably the only connection it had to anything all season. Performance was only marginally better in the grand scheme of things, but with Todd on board and with the team for the entirety of 1994 and then onwards, things could start to be put into place. Things got put into place so quickly that by the start of 1997, Montezemolo, Todd, Brawn, Byrne, Stepney and Schumacher would all be in the same garage at Fiorano, and the rest, they say, is history. So then, a look at the 1993 Ferrari F93A, Ferrari's attempt at an active car that was an abject failure, but it also marked the start of the Jean Todt years at the team that led into one of the biggest dynasties Formula One has ever seen. If this has been an interesting look through the motorsport history books, then do give the video a like so I know I did a good job, and for more stuff from the channel, get subscribed and also get the bell on so you never miss out on anything else I do around here. Massive thanks as always go out to the fine bunch of lads over at Patreon for the continued support, and if you want to help with the picture purchasing piggy bank or otherwise keep the computer turned on, there's a link to Patreon in the description, along with links to Discord, socials, affiliates and other bits and pieces you might want or need to know. Or there's super thanks if you want to top up my coffee cup and memberships so you can do Patreon without the Patreon. So until next time, I've been Aidan Millward, have a great day wherever you are, and goodbye.